From left to right, James Marsh, Murray Gartner, and Phil C. Neal. Clerk for the 1943 and 1944 term for Justice Robert Jackson, Mr. Phil C. Neal.
Less talk between Jackson and other justices about the business of the court, certainly prior to a conference on a case, than was true of maybe some others. I mean, it may be that Murphy and Douglas or Murphy and Black talked more about cases. But Jackson, by and large, I think, pretty much wrote his own vote. I mean, you've doubtless heard from others about the motto that Jackson had over his fireplace, in a framed, embroidered something or other. He travels the fastest who travels alone.
In the spring of 1945, Phil Neal left to go to San Francisco and was replaced by Murray Gartner, who completed the 1944 term and was there for the 1945 and 1946 term as the law clerk to Justice Robert Jackson.
Jackson was a complex personality. He was not a simple man. Again, I think a lot of the people who might have written biographies are put off by the fact that he's described as a country lawyer. They think, oh, well, you know, what can there be there? He was just a country lawyer. Of course, he liked to describe himself as a country lawyer because in one case, I think it was Frank Hogan, called him a country lawyer, and he grabbed onto that and said, well, that's great. I mean, I'm proud to be called a country lawyer, and of course it may disarm some of my opponents if they think they're coming up against a country lawyer. He was no country lawyer in the sense that he was a hayseed. He was a very, very intelligent, brilliant man.
For the 1947 and 1948 terms was James M. Marsh.
And we talked about Roosevelt, we talked about Nuremberg and all that, and well, I thought the time was running out. I said, no, I have to tell you, Mr. Justice, I had an ulterior motive in coming down here. I wanted to talk to you about the falsity of a clerkship. So he said, well, I've talked to some people, but I haven't made any commitments. So he said, you know, send me an application, send me some references, and we'll see. So I, of course, knew who to ask to be my references, and I said the other day, I read those letters that sent supporting me recently. I didn't recognize myself. I don't think anybody could be that smart at that age. But he got the stuff and he called me back for a second interview. And at that time, he right on the table, he said, you know, you give me a problem. He said, if I hire you, we'll be running these chambers without one college degree. I have no degree. Mrs. Douglas has no degree. You have no degree. And I've always felt that my lack of formal education hampered me in my writing. So I said, Mr. Justice, every judge and every lawyer in the country knows you're the best writer on this court, college degree or not. And if there's one thing I can do is write and rewrite and edit writing, I've been doing it all my life. And I said, you can find lots of guys that know more law than I do, but I don't think you'll find anybody who can do that job any better than I can. So if that's the kind of guy you want, and somebody will be, I remember saying I had a flair for people and for politics, be fiercely loyal to you, I'm your man. So shortly after, I got a letter saying he offered me the job and told me about the pay scale. The basic scale was $4,221.
The clerk for Justice Jackson during the 1949 term was Howard C. Bushman, Jr.
And yes, he was known for his fluency with the language. One of his best thing that he ever did was a concurrence. As he wrote it, concurring and dissenting, each in part. That was CIO v. Dowds, Dorsey, and that was it was a dissent. And but anyway, this guy had been. I think it was a disbarment case, and he used language, somebody else's language, and they were saying he was plagiarizing. But I should not like. Oh, I like this. I should suppose that so far as the law is concerned, one may as effectively father statements by adoption as by conception, and that sincerely subscribing to what another has written for him does not constitute legal deceit or ground for disbarment, impeachment, or other penalty. But I like that. You could father statements by adoption as well as by conception.
During the 1950 and 51 term of the United States Supreme Court, the clerk for Justice Jackson was C. George Niebank, Jr.
Well, now, at the court, once Justice Jackson once said to me, he said, "No, George, this is early on, after you've been here a while, you may be somewhat disillusioned," he said, "but just want to warn you in advance." And I saw what he had in mind. It's like 9 law offices in one building. And they're not like they're partners or anything, but 9 law offices, and they've got a job to do, and they do it. Like lawyers, you know, that's nothing unusual about that. Although each with his own style, of course. Now, of all the justices, the one that Justice Jackson was closest to, by all odds, was Frankfurter. You know, which is an interesting combination, the country lawyer and the Harvard professor. But they got along marvelously well.
Was Jackson deemed at that time to be a terrific writer?
Oh, yes. He was, that was one of his most prominent skills. He was, I would say, certainly one of the best writers on the court in the 20th century. And he was fun to write with. I did a lot of that.
Yeah.
And he liked to do it. There'll be more about that.
Current Chief Justice William Rehnquist was Justice Jackson's law clerk during the years 1951 and 1952.
In those days, the idea of flying back from Stanford, California to Washington, D.C. for an interview to see if you wanted to be, if you would be accepted as a Supreme Court lawyer was virtually unheard of for people of ordinary student means. And you know, to take the train for several days, you wouldn't do either. So people really on the East Coast, at the East Coast schools, had a much better chance of getting, if the justice wanted an interview, a much better chance of getting the job just because they could, it was manageable to come from Boston or New Haven or New York and even Chicago. And so when one of Justice Jackson's previous law clerks, Phil Neal, who was then teaching at Stanford, asked me if I'd ever thought of clerking at the court, I said no, I hadn't. And he said, well, you know, I clerk for Justice Jackson. Justice Jackson's coming here to dedicate the new law school. Would you like to interview with him if he comes? And I said, sure. And so Justice Jackson, when he was out at Stanford, interviewed me. And I mentioned in the book that as soon as he discovered that I was of Swedish extraction, he regaled me with tales of some of his Swedish clients in Jamestown, New York. And I thought, surely, you know, that he'd just given up on me, that he was just making me feel good. And then several months later, I got a letter from him saying, well, would you like to come and be my clerk? So I did.
A co-clerk with Chief Justice William Rehnquist was Donald Cronson, who joined us in Jamestown making a special trip from Switzerland in 2003.
And I remember my first day I reported for work. That's another conversation I remember, among the many that I forgot. But the one I remember on that occasion was that he explained to me that he had come up as a young lawyer in upstate New York, where he interviewed the client, he collected the facts, he did the legal research, he prepared the pleadings, he did the trial brief, he conducted the trial, he made the post-trial motions, he submitted the briefs. If there was an appeal, he submitted it, he tried the trial. You know, it was his method of working was he would be the guy who did everything. He said, I was the despair of some people in the Justice Department, because even when I got with all those hundreds of lawyers, I still had a tendency to just mark out certain things where I was going to do it mainly myself and just only loosely look after what was being done by the others. And he said, now, on this court, I'm the guy who's going to do the opinions. That doesn't mean I'm not going to ask for your help, but that's going to be my responsibility. You and Rehnquist are the guys who are going to look after the cert petitions. Now, that doesn't mean you can do anything you want to. I'm going to check what you do and we'll talk about it, but that's your responsibility, and that's the way it's going to work. And with a few exceptions, that's the way it did work.
Justice Jackson's last clerk for the years 1953 through 1954 was E. Barrett Prettyman, Jr.
And I think that part of the legacy also is simply his rise. I mean, when you take a lawyer, a Democrat in Republican territory, doing what you do in a town like Jamestown, which I would guess that while there are business cases, an awful lot of it was wills, trusts, and estates and things of that sort, and see his rise from that through the various steps, Solicitor General, Attorney General, Supreme Court Justice, Nuremberg. That's amazing. I mean, that takes more than just a glib tongue. Mm-hmm. That's force of personality and intelligence in the best sense. He was not an academic, and I don't mean to put academics down, but that was not how, he was not a Frankfurter. Mm-hmm. He was a very practical man.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for watching Time Warner Cable 8 News on this Friday, May 16th, 2003. I'm Mark Ashgarian.
And I'm Casey Bortnick. Nice to have you with us.
Topping the broadcast, the United States Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist makes a stop in Jamestown today to honor his former boss.
Rehnquist pays his respects to Justice Robert A. Jackson today as he delivered the keynote address during the official dedication of the Jackson Center. The country's highest-ranking member of the judicial branch, 78-year-old Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist in Jamestown, to dedicate the center established as a legacy to his former boss, Robert H. Jackson. Rehnquist served as Jackson's law clerk in the 1950s and became a quick study of his work.
But what strikes me most about his court work was his masterful use of the English language. What makes this mastery truly impressive is the fact that Jackson had no formal education beyond high school, except a year at the Albany Law School. And certainly law schools are not places known for their teachers of great English prose style.
Rehnquist says although Jackson was instrumental in domestic cases, including a legal opinion regarding the separation of power between the country's 3 branches of government, that's still cited today, his greatest achievement was his work prosecuting Nazi war criminals following World War II.
Jackson said that his Nuremberg role, quote, was the supremely interesting and important work of my life, and an experience which would be unique in the life of any lawyer.
Rehnquist says Jackson's application of international law during the military tribunal was courageous despite criticism in the United States and overseas.
Whatever the merit of these objections, the Nuremberg trials were surely superior to the summary court-martial proceedings favored by some members of the administration and the summary executions initially favored by the British.
Chief Justice Rehnquist highlighted Jackson's work as the chief prosecutor during the Nuremberg war trials in the 1940s. Although Rehnquist says he was fascinated by the proceedings, he wasn't eager to ask Jackson about the experience due to the controversial nature of the war trials.
So I studiously refrained from asking him anything about them. But one day, a friend of mine who I'd known at graduate school was down visiting me. And then he said to Justice Jackson, what I'd never dared say, how do you justify the Nuremberg trials? There was this guy, 25 years old. Well, Justice Jackson went into a 10 or 15 minute eloquent justification of the Nuremberg trials. He actually welcomed the question, and I was pleased there to be in the audience just to hear it.
Rehnquist, who was elevated to the position of Chief Justice in 1986, served as Jackson's law clerk for a year and a half before the 82nd U.S. Supreme Court Justice passed away in 1954. Rehnquist says although Jackson's gone, his legacy of the American ideal of fairness and justice is something Chautauqua County should be proud of.
Surely Jamestown and Chautauqua County can be proud of the career of their native son on both the national and the international scene.
Well, after the speech, Rehnquist attended a lunch reception at the Chautauqua Institution where he was made an honorary member of the Norden Club, established for professional gentlemen of Swedish descent.